On the 7th of April, the 75th Economic Policy Panel will be discussing the long-term economic effects of lost learning due to COVID-19. Well, earlier I spoke to Nicola Fuchs-Schundhelm, who will be presenting her research to find out what we now know about the impact of closed schools and what action policymakers can take to help this COVID generation make up for lost time. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Tim.
Nicola, you focused on the US and Germany for your research, although schools were closed everywhere, of course. But how did the extent and the type of school closures differ between the two countries?
So what we find is that from the start of the crisis in March 2020 to the summer of 2021, school children in the US on average lost 55% of their schooling time, and school children in Germany lost 45% of their schooling time. So there was a little bit shorter closure in Germany than in the US, but overall the closures were substantial in both of these countries. And then, of course, as in, I guess, any country worldwide, you had a lot of heterogeneity of school closures within a country, both on the grade level and also on the regional level. And here what we find is that in the US you see that schools were closed for the shortest time in elementary schools, and then longer for middle school students, and then longest for high school students. And this pattern is slightly different in Germany. So in Germany, we also see that middle school students, they're hit by longer closures than elementary school children. But then Germany really chose to protect the children who are in the highest grade, so who are close to graduating from school. And here really the differences were quite steep. So on average, kids in the last year of high school, they had school closures that only amounted to a reduction of around 20% of schooling time, while children in grades 5 to 9, they lost more than half of their overall schooling time.
And within the countries, was there regional variation?
Yes, there was actually quite a bit of regional variation, especially in the US. So what you observe in the US is that schools in poorer regions, they were closed on average for a substantially smaller amount of time than schools in richer regions. So on average, the children who live in regions that belong to the bottom quartile of the income distribution, they lost 48% of their schooling time, and the children who live in regions that belong to the top quartile of the income distribution, they lost 62%. So where does this come from? So here my co-authors, they actually find very interestingly that regions that had a high Republican vote share, they face significantly shorter closures, and regions that have very strong teacher unions, they face longer closures. And what you have in the US is that especially the coastal regions on both the West Coast and on the East Coast, they are relatively rich, they have strong teacher union, they have a high Democratic vote share, so a low Republican vote share, and these are the regions that had the longest closures. So within Germany we also see some regional variation, but it's really, really minor compared to what we see in the US.
Using these statistics, you've been able to model the long-term losses, both to children and to the economy as a whole of these school closures. What's the mechanism in the model that causes these losses?
Exactly. So right now, if we want to understand, does this hurt the children or not? I mean, really the only thing we can do is we can rely on a model, and that's what we do. So to assess the long-run losses for the affected children, we build a model and simulate the school closures within the model. So what happens in the model is that kids are born with a certain human capital that depends on the human capital of their parents through the process of nature. And then while they are young, they accumulate human capital. And they do that by, on the one hand, going to school and just receiving schooling input. And on the other hand, they also receive investments by their parents. So parents invest both money and time into their children. Now, when the schools are closed, the schooling input into children drops. And the parents realize that, and they try to counteract this effect by increasing their own investment into children. But parents don't have unlimited resources, both in terms of money and also in terms of time. So they do react to the school closures, they invest more into their own children, but they cannot completely compensate the effect of the school closures. And what then happens is that children arrive at the age of 16 with less human capital than they would have had in the absence of the closures. And some of them then decide not to continue with higher education. So what we find is that more kids will drop out of high school than they would have had in the absence of the closures, and less will attend college. And then both the lower human capital and the lower final educational attainment of the children leads to long-term earnings losses once the children enter the labor market.
I see. So how large are these earnings losses going to be for affected children?
Yeah, we try to put a number on this by calibrating the model carefully to the US economy. And what we then find is that the model predicts that on average, children's earnings will drop by 1.7% due to the school closures. So first, 1.7%, that might not sound that large, but then we have to realize that these children, they are still entering the labor market. So for 45 years in the labor market, year after year, they will earn 1.7% less than they would have done in the absence of the closures. And also economy-wise, if we just sum this up over the large number of children that were affected by the school closures, and then we discount it to today, this amounts to 2.4% of the US pre-crisis GDP. So basically, we unearth a significant additional economic cost of the COVID crisis, which will only arise in the future, and thus it's not easily measurable, but which is really substantial as well.
From what you're saying, it sounds like these losses aren't borne equally. Is there going to be an increase in inequality in your model?
Exactly. So what we find is that the closures definitely will increase inequality. The main issue here is that the parents of the children, they have different resources at hand to support their children while the schools are closed. So first, richer parents, they can raise their monetary investment into the children by more. So they can hire online tutors, they can purchase online learning programs and so on. And richer parents, on average, even have more time at hand to invest into their children because they are more likely to be married. And for married couples, it's just easier to spend more time with the children now than for single earner parents. So in the US, we actually have the counteracting effect that on average, the children from poorer regions, they face shorter closures. But despite this effect, we find that the welfare losses are twice as large for the children from poor households and for children from rich households.
So give me an idea about how big this GDP effect is.
So what we find in the GDP effect is that it sums up to 2.4% of the GDP. So the immediate COVID recession in the US was around 5 to 6% of GDP. So it's like half of that or less than half of that, but still it's substantial, right? It's not a number that is easily negligible. And I think what is just so different from the other COVID costs, which are obviously also substantial, is that we really only will observe these costs in the long run, but still they can be attributed to the COVID crisis.
Do you have any idea from your work whether kids in the US or in Germany are going to suffer more from this effect?
Well, we only calibrate the model to US data, partly because we don't have all the data for Germany available. But I think we can learn some general lessons from the model, and then based on what we observe in the differences in the school closure data, we can make some inferences for Germany. So first, what we see in the data is that on average the school closures were somewhat shorter in Germany than in the US. So the losses overall are probably also somewhat smaller in Germany than in the US. On the other hand, I think we can expect a larger socioeconomic gradient in the losses in Germany. And that is because in the US we have this strong countervailing effect that schools in poorer regions were closed for a shorter time. And we don't have that in Germany. So what I would expect is that in Germany, especially poorer children suffer more relative to the richer children than what we have in the US. And the second thing I would suspect is that we will see a larger age gradient in the losses in Germany. So in general, one lesson from the model is that younger children suffer more from the school closures. So why is that? Well, that is because learning builds on itself. So if young children, they don't learn well how to write, how to read, how to do math, that makes learning in the entire future school years still to come harder. While if children in the last years of schooling, they are hit by the crisis, they won't learn calculus that well, they won't do another in-depth analysis of an essay, but that is not so detrimental for the overall human capital accumulation. So in that sense, school closures are always hardest for the youngest children and less so for the older children. And in the US, what you see is that the older children, on the other hand, they face the longest closures. But in Germany, we see the opposite. It was especially the children who are in the last years of schooling, those close to graduation, that were largely shielded from the school closures. So in that sense, I would think that the older children in Germany, they will do relatively well, but that might not be the case for the younger children.
Now, if there was something that was going to cause an immediate GDP loss of 2 point something percent, then policymakers would be running around thinking we really must do something about it absolutely now. As you say, this loss happens in the future, so maybe there isn't quite as much urgency about putting policies in place to fix it. But if policymakers were to do something now, what should they be doing? And should they be doing it for everyone, or should they be targeting what they do?
So first, let me say that I agree with you. I mean, these losses, they are just not so visible. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why early on in the crisis, there was much less discussion about the school closures than about business closures, or so, where you clearly see the business owners, they are affected right away, the clients, they are affected right away. But then, on the other hand, if we want to counteract this loss, I think it's actually important to act now. So again, what the model predicts is learning builds on itself. So any learning loss hurts, and the faster we can counteract it, the more efficient that will be. So in the spirit of the model, really what governments should do if they want to help these children is they should increase schooling time right now, maybe by extending schooling into the summer vacation or other measures like that. And the second thing that clearly comes out of the model is that they should target that to children from poor households to make it most effective. What we actually find in our model is that if one were to increase schooling time for everyone in the next 2 summers in the US, that would be a policy that is certainly costly, but it will pay for itself. So it would counteract the learning loss of the children, and that leads to higher earnings of the children in the future, and then higher tax revenues of the government. And these discounted tax revenues, they largely coincide with the current losses. So in that sense, it might not even be a very expensive policy of the government to do that. But this policy really would pay off in the future.
Well, it's a very clear mandate, isn't it? No kid likes giving up their summer vacation, but this might be the best thing that we could do for them in the long run. Nicola, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
The paper's called COVID School Closures and Children's Futures, Long-Term Distributional Effects of Lost Learning in Germany and the US. And Nicola's going to be presenting it at the 75th Economic Policy Panel. That's on the 7th of April, 17:15 European time. Use the link that's on the screen now to find out how you can sign up. If the 7th of April's already come and gone, then you can also use that link to watch back the recording of her presentation. Well, that's all for now, and we will see you soon.